السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل الأمر يتطلب إيمانا وشجاعة كبيرين للدفاع عن العدالة في مواجهة الشدائد الساحقة الطاحنة. على مر التاريخ لطالما استهدفت الحكومات الاستبدادية أولئك الأشخاص الذين ارتقوا إلى مستوى الحديث عن العدل والمساواة والحب والحرية والسلام. ولعل ضيفنا اليوم سيستمر طويلا في خوض هذه المعركة النبيلة والشرسة. هذه المواجهة عبر الموسيقى والكلمات والأداء الأخاذ يخوضها فنان الهيب هوب البريطاني والمثقف السياسي والثوري المتميز دائما لوكي. ولد لوكي لأم عراقية وأب إنجليزي، وارتقى إلى الصدارة في مشهد الهيب هوب البريطاني تماما كمستقل. لم يوقع أبدا مع شركة تسجيل انطلاقا من مبدأ النزاهة وحرية الإبداع والاستقلالية. بطبيعة الحال فإن الموسيقى لدى لوكي هذا الفنان الموهوب واللامع تتدفق في عروقه، وأغانيه مليئة برسائل رنانة ضد العنصرية والكراهية ضد الأجانب والنيوليبرالية والإمبريالية والاحتلال والإرهاب وعناوين إنسانية أخرى. منذ عام 2016 حتى اليوم باتت موسيقى لوكي وإنتاجاته القيمة والقوية برسائلها تسهم في تثقيف المجتمع وإلهام الجماهير وتغييرها ولا سيما الشباب. الفنان الرائع لوكي ينضم إلينا من لندن في هذا اللقاء الخاص للحديث عن مواضيع هي جوهر كلماته وحياته واستمراريته صعودا وتأثيرا وبريقا. أهلا بكم إلى الحلقة الأولى مع فنان الراب والغرايم لوكي من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا.
When our government drops bombs on other people around the world, we are them and they are us.
I'm all about peace and love. They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terrorist, insulting my intelligence. With me now, free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine.
You can try to avoid us, but it's pointless. You can never avoid the voices of the voiceless.
Take our freedom, take our pride, come on, baby, we'll fight.
British Iraqi hip-hop legend Karim Dennis, known as Loki, activist / campaigner and poet / playwright. Best of the best UK MCs. Welcome to Min الداخل from the inside, Loki.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you on Min الداخل.
Thank you for being here. Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, to start, as an adjective, the definition of Loki is someone or something that is relatively calm, placid, or not full of excitement. Yet, your words, music, and messages through your songs have always conveyed loud, politically complex, and intriguing issues, which definitely made you the exceptionally gifted rapper, actually. For instance, your music can't be separated from the war on terror. Tell us more, Loki, please.
Well, I would say the closest translation to Loki in Arabic would be maghmoor or majhool. I would say, of course, I came of age at a time where state surveillance massively increased, where racialization of a certain group within the society was really present as a part of government policy. You have to remember that Britain is a country that, by some estimates, houses over 105 US military installations. What that lends itself to is a relationship between this place, which ironically is the place that the 13 colonies in the Americas rebelled against King George in order to get their independence from British rule. Today, and particularly post-World War II, Britain is in many ways a colony of the United States. And so my generation, we were simultaneously the products of people who had fought against Thatcher's policies and organizations like the National Front prior to that, but they'd also been demobilized by UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's kind of attacking of civil society, of organized collective bargaining by the labor movement. And so then what came out was those of us who were deeply influenced in an uncritical way by US culture. So really hip hop first started to influence me and others in my generation as a form of cultural imperialism. But much like, and this is not to compare myself in any way to the Beatles, but much like the Beatles, music was produced out of an experience in Liverpool, surrounded by US military bases, a really clear umbilical relationship between the music that was being produced in the US and the youth that the Beatles would become. They really were influenced by US culture, took it in. But later, of course, you had the example of Paul McCartney speaking against nuclear weapons. You had John Lennon funding the Black Panthers and even the IRA at one point. So very much I would describe myself as coming from a generation that was deeply influenced by the United States, but later on were essentially radicalized by its politics and put into a position where we would use the music that we had and use the culture that we'd kind of had the tehjeen, الثقافات. We're talking about the hybridization of cultures.
Sure.
That's what happened here. And we turned it into something that could also be used to resist.
Right. As a talented and brilliant MC, some might argue that how much you are dangerous is the fact that your words resonate with the crowds, with the youth, with your followers and fans. They're always yelling and shouting, "We want Loki," to the extent that one expert studying anti-Israel activity described the increasing influence of performance such as you, Loki, as, quote, a potential nightmare. Why do you think your words resonate?
Well, because you have to understand that the Zionists...
And actually, I'm using the words of Akala in this sense.
Okay. So also you have to understand that the Zionist enterprise necessitated a certain level of pious hypocrisy, meaning that within the state of Israel, it's quite understood that what they have done and what they did do is violent colonialism. You look at the Jewish fund, which today is essential to the Jewish National Fund, which is essential to the building of settlements in the West Bank, illegal settlements. Formerly, it was known as the Jewish Colonial Fund. It was understood by early Zionist thinkers like Theodor Herzl, like Nathan Birnbaum, who later became an anti-Zionist, who was credited with coining the phrase Zionism, by other main figures in the Zionist movement, that what they were doing was a colonial endeavor. You had, for instance, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the person who today there are more streets and parks and roads named after in the state of Israel, in the Zionist entity, than any other historical figure from the Zionist movement. Well, Vladimir Jabotinsky said absolutely clearly that what we're doing is colonialism and any indigenous population will resist alien invaders. However, on the outside of the, away from Palestine, you have had to have an attempt to depict what Israel does as a form of peaceful immigration. And so you get people like Martin Buber, who were a very insignificant part of the Zionist movement, who called for a kind of non-state-centric spiritual immigration side of Zionism. You had others who were basically advocating for a sort of form of binationalism. This is prior to the foundation of the Zionist state. And so what you have is a concentration on them,
Yes,
especially
Loki.
in...
Yes,
And so
but-
just to finish the point,
Sure.
then if you are aiming to discredit this enterprise and really point at it and point out the ways in which it affects people materially and it harms them materially, and call for people to join in with BDS and other ways of supporting the Palestinian resistance, then of course you would be seen as being active in the cultural sphere as potentially a threat to that.
at the Oxford Union, you said that the Arab world, between quotations, has not failed the Palestinian people. Who did?
Well, the understanding at that debate, which was held against, on the other side, was the former head of British forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is somebody who called for the internment of thousands of Muslims in this country. I was putting forward an argument that was attempting to make and form an equivalence between the populations who are mostly ruled by a Arabic-speaking representative class of what is the global 1%, essentially. That, you know, people have not had self-determination since the Sykes-Picot. People have not had any form of self-determination in most Arabic-speaking societies. They haven't had the chance to choose their leadership. When they have had surveys carried out and they've been asked who is the number one threat to them, they point to the state of Israel, because of course Israel has invaded every single country that it quote unquote borders with. It does not define its own borders. It has bombed as far as Sudan, to Syria. So it has launched clandestine operations in Egypt, in Iraq. This is well known. This is well known. People have a clear understanding of what Zionism has meant to their surroundings. However, at the same time, what this debate was attempting to do was to force an equivalence between the rulers and the populations that they rule. So I think this is a dangerous equivalence, because on one side, the British mainstream position is that the Arab world, quote unquote, needs more democracy. But you can't have it both ways by saying it needs more democracy, but the democratic will, which is no normalization with Israel, okay, and is support of the Palestinians, is somehow not included and is somehow representative of the entire population of many, many millions of Arabic-speaking people. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I problematized that and made sure we won that debate, you know.
Well, it's hard to know where to begin describing soundtrack to the Struggle 2, which was released in April 2019. Experts note that it is musically sweeping, it demonstrates some glorious genre smashing, and overall the album marks a pointed change in Loki's artistry since 2011's first soundtrack. But with this album, the neo-soul elements are perhaps Loki's most accomplished musical moments. Two of the greatest thinkers of modern times bookend the album: Noam Chomsky on the title track and Naomi Klein on Neoliberalism Kills People. Why the 8-year lull, and what was the ultimate message through this powerful comeback, whether in shape, in content, and in music?
Well, originally I had released the album in 2011, Soundtrack to the Struggle 1, and for an independent artist, it did surprisingly well. It charted in this country, which is rare for independent releases at that time. However, following that, I saw that it would be good for me at that age and at that time to really continue my studies. I trained to be a teacher in English. I have a qualification as a personal trainer, and I also have a master's in quote unquote Near and Middle East studies, and I also worked during that time in Calais as a translator for people that were attempting to come to this country as refugees. Mm-hmm. So following on from that, with this large resource of experience and also working with other political organizations, I thought it would also be a good time to come back out with more music. And essentially the purpose of the music is to serve a role in the wider political struggle. It has always been important to me that the music doesn't just exist in the cultural sphere, that it directly interacts with existing political movements. And so with, Jeremy Corbyn being thrust to the front of the Labour Party, and also with the other movements thrusting from the bottom up, I was happy to get more involved with the music and start using the music to really attempt to force that. We live in systems of essentially inverted totalitarianism, meaning بالعربي يقولون الشمولية معكوسة, meaning you have a system whereby the permanent interests cannot be voted against. So we can vote for episodic representation within the British Parliament, but we cannot vote against the interests of arms companies like BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin, that throughout the war on terror, Lockheed Martin, for example, increased its stock value by 1,200%.
Right. In this sense, Loki, observers note that due to your outspokenness, as well as the respect you garnered from the eloquence and lack of profanity in your lyrics, you were targeted by the British government. In December 2010, your home was raided, your lyrics and clothes, among many other issues, were confiscated. Was that to stop the public from hearing messages of truth in the transcendent medium of arts? Gossipers, for example, about your hiatus come up with many theories, one of them being that you got intimidated by the British government into retiring.
No, that's not true. It was to do with the student movement at the time, and I was arrested and I went through the court process with that. And by the time that I stopped making music for a short period of about 3 years, I had already gone and concluded the court case that came off the back of that initial situation. Since then, of course, I have been detained by not just the British, but also Israeli soldiers. I have been questioned under Schedule 7 Terrorism Act by the British police. So, it's been a constant, to be politically active in this country is akin.
Has to come at a price. True.
Well, the way the state sees it, the way the state understands it, is akin to organized crime, right? However, the state has quite a successful PR system which allows the propagation of certain mythologies about our society. So for people to even have the right to vote that don't own property in this country, they had to struggle for 300 years, 300 to 400 years, people had to struggle for that. For women to get the right to vote in this country, they had to throw bricks through number 10 Downing Street. They had to attempt to throw Winston Churchill under a train. Okay, it wasn't until the end of World War I that women had the right to vote. And then later on, people that didn't own property had the right to vote. So in a sense, we're planting seeds for trees that we might not sit in the shade of. And when you understand the levels of demonization that are sent towards people that have certain signifiers in their identity, then it was inevitable that these would be the kind of things that I'd come up against, partly in tandem with the music, partly relating to the music, but also independent of the music. I would also no doubt face this type of suppression at the hands of the British state. And actually, I faced more incidents of being detained, more incidents of being questioned, more difficult situations vis-a-vis the media when I wasn't making music than when I was making music. So
how ironic.
People may have sort of theories, but I'm here now and I'm doing what I'm doing and I continue to do what I do. So it can't have been very effective if that's what the state was trying to do.
You have become a legend, actually. In a similar vein, Loki, Britain's counter-terrorism program PREVENT violates human rights. Well, until we agree on who are the real terrorists, it will remain a very controversial issue. Your song Terrorist echoes this reality and delves into the situation surrounding your political arrest. How dangerous is this program PREVENT in who it targets?
Well, the key issue with PREVENT is that the Equalities Act 2010 in this country says that you cannot discriminate against any person because of their religious views or political views. Now, what Prevent asks people to do, and let's make sure the viewer understands, is it's a way in which the government assesses people's likelihood to commit acts of political violence. So let's be clear. In the worst year of terrorism in the world, you had about 25,000 people dying. The majority of those people that died from those forms of political violence were in Iraq, were in Syria, were in Pakistan, were in Nigeria. 0.5% of all people that die from acts of terrorism are in the Western world, quote unquote. Literally, you have 7 million people dying every year due to pollution. You have over 1 million people dying every year due to car accidents. Within the British context, even British Army expert on terrorism, Chris Hunter, said that you have a 1 in 16 million chance in this country of being anywhere near an act of political violence, i.e. terrorism. Mark Sageman, the CIA analyst, in his book Misunderstanding Terrorism, said that across the war on terror, we have had to detain 250,000 people for every one person we have found to have some involvement in political violence. And he said less than 1 in every million Muslims in the world has had anything to do with this form of political violence. So what we see is an industry of threat inflation, in which millions and millions of pounds is invested every single year. You know, the Prevent program has about £50 million funding every year in Britain. And for a country that only has a population of 67 million people, that's quite a lot. And what it does is it allows 3-year-old children who express political opinions in class to be questioned by police without the presence or the knowledge of their parents. And so it is in that way that it is a totalitarian policy. It acts to demobilize young people, to push not only Muslims but other people that hope to be politically active away from any form of political activity within British society. And so it is one of the myriad of ways that the state treats political activity as akin to organized crime in this country.
Allow me to stop you here. That makes it for this part of من الداخل special with Loki, hip-hop artist and activist. Thank you for attempting to carry on such a noble message and for working hard towards turning the word of justice you envision actually into reality through your art. You will be joining us for a second part to discuss more Palestine, Afghanistan, along other issues. Ultimate pleasure to have you always, Loki.
Thank you.
ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.